For those of you who aren't familiar with Live Local, it is a kind of bellmark piece of legislation that was passed a year ago to promote and incentivize affordable housing throughout the state of Florida. It was spawned and supported by Senator Kathleen Passiduomo. You're going to hear Kathleen tomorrow morning at his keynote speech, and she's going to talk about Live Local and the housing conditions in the state of Florida. A panel together here, and this is kind of a unique perspective that we're looking at. We want to hear from all various different stakeholders and professionals within the affordable housing space. So I've got an architect, a city planner, a developer, and a government official. And I'm going to start throwing some questions out at it. But before we get started, everybody reminds you, cell phones off. It's first ring is $50 to FAPAC. We know that, right? Okay.
Check my out here.
And the other thing I'd like you to do is this is something new this year. We're doing these 90-minute sequences. On your convention evaluation form, I really would like you to tell us what you think of the 90-minute versus the 60-minute. The reason we picked certain topics that we felt we needed to dive deeper into, and 60 minutes didn't provide us quite the framework to do it. So with that being said, I want to introduce our panel this afternoon, and we will start with a page that I probably don't know where it is. Here we go. First person on the dais here is Kathleen Hartley. Kathleen is a senior manager at Benesch, a national engineering and planning firm. She has over 20 years of experience in comprehensive and land use planning for both public and private sectors. Her career has focused on the integration of transportation and land use and making traditional walkable places legal in comprehensive plans and zoning codes. In recent years, she has focused her energy on zoning reform and removing regulational barriers for affordable and missing middle housing. She's an accredited member of both American Planning Association and the Congress of New Urbanism. Seated next to her, we all know and love Jeffrey Huber. Jeffrey's FAIA is a principal at the Florida studio manager at Brooks and Scarpa Architects. He is also an associate professor at Florida Atlantic University School of Architecture. Jeff's work combines ecological, landscape, and urban and architectural design with a focus on resiliency and adaptation. His designs and research have gained over 70 national and international awards, and he has been published in numerous books and periodicals. Jeff is currently serving a 3-year term as AIA's National Strategic Counselor, which is ending, I believe, this year, isn't it? This is your last year?
This is.
Yeah. Jeff earned a Bachelor's of Design and Master of Architecture degree from the University of Florida and a Master of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design from Florida International University. Seated next to him is Jake Zoneman, who is a Senior Vice President of Development at the Smith & Hensey Affordable Group. Jake is responsible for identifying new sites, underwriting and analyzing various financial structures, and directing projects from inception through completion. Jake joined Smith & Hensey in 2022 to grow the company's footprint. Prior to joining Smith & Hensey, he was a Senior Vice President of Development for the Housing Trust Group, where he oversaw the creation of over 1,000 units of new affordable housing and spearheaded the company's expansion into Illinois. Okay. Jake holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and is a graduate of the University of South Florida's Community Real Estate Development Program. Next to Jake is Cormac Giblin. Cormac is the Director of Housing Policy and Economic Development for Collier County, Florida. Cormac has over 25 years of experience managing all aspects of community planning and development, ranging from community development to large-scale new towns and villages. After working for 10 years in local government, he went to become project manager at a national engineering and consulting firm and later held positions in several high-profile nonprofit housing organizations. Cormack then returned to the Collier County government as a planning manager overseeing all zoning actions, site plan reviews, and permitting. He is now the director of the county's Housing Policy and Economic Development Division, where he is responsible for the development and management of long-range planning, housing affordability, and economic development. He's also the author of the county's first ever community housing plan in 2017 and worked with the community partners and government to implement it. And then finally, we have Shane Phillips. Shane is a researcher, lecturer, and a consultant on housing affordability. He manages the housing initiative at the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, focusing on research, policy analysis, and education. He also co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast and is the author of The Affordable City, which advocates for the prioritization of supply, stabilization, and subsidy. Shane has presented to audiences across the U.S. and abroad and has written housing policy for major regional and national publications. As a consultant, he has worked with public agencies and private stakeholders to design context-sensitive housing solutions for their communities. Originally from Seattle, Shane earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and master's degree in public administration and urban planning from USC. In addition to his participation in this panel, Shane will be presenting his views on housing stability in session G, which will take place next door immediately after we're done here. So with that said, this is going to be a conversation, but before the conversation starts, I've asked each of the panelists, and I was very tough on them. I said 3 to 5 minutes, no more. A little background on what they do, what they represent, what projects they may have been working on that use Live Local or analyze Live Local. So on that point, did they give you the clicker?
You put me in charge of this, unfortunately.
They did. Before we get into her, we've got our normal AIA. You got to talk about the description of the project. Next slide is probably the learning objectives. You can all read those later on, and then we go into the presentation. Yeah. Okay. So.
Oh, I'm first.
Catherine, take it.
Do I go to the podium or just stay here?
You can stay. Man, this is a conversation. You can just sit.
Why they put me in charge of this thing, I have no idea. Okay. So I just need to explain to you for a second how I got here today. So I started my career at the Florida Department of Community Affairs, which has now changed names 3 times since then, over 20-something years, while I was still in graduate school getting a master's degree in planning. I had done some undergraduate work in planning too, so I was able to start a job at the state while I was going through graduate school. And there I got into the space of reviewing local government comprehensive plans for consistency with Florida statute, right? So I got to know the rules for a while. And then I moved on in my career. Eventually, I wound up at a director position in 2016 with the city of Bradenton. So all of a sudden, while most of my career I had just been a planner and just did either, plan review or comprehensive plans or whatever, I got to a director position. So under me, I had affordable housing for the very first time. Most planners are not exposed to affordable housing until they get to a position like me, because it's kind of like that's a different space, right? Managing the CDBG grants and all of that stuff. So a normal day-to-day planner doesn't do that, but as a director, I got exposed to it. So I had affordable housing, the building permit folks, so the building, all the inspections, all that stuff under me that you are all familiar with as architects. And then of course planning, I had planning under me, long range and short range planning, and code enforcement. I have to incidentally tell a little bit of story about another panelist, Jake, who is here with us today. Jake was the first developer. He was trying to do a LIHTC project in the city of Bradenton. And he, of course, came to me because I was the director to talk about his project. He wanted to float the idea before, that's what you do, right? You walk in and you pitch your stuff. Jake was the first person to sit down and explain to me how hard it is to build affordable housing. Like light bulb goes off, right? I'm thinking, well, what can I do now to make this easier for these guys? Because we know we need it, right? We need it a lot. What can I do do that. Okay, so that's how I got into the space that I'm at today. I left the city of Bradenton in 2020. If you work for city government for a lot of years, if you know, you get exhausted and you leave. I now work for Benish, which is a consulting firm, and I'm helping local governments figure out this stuff, right? Okay, so that's my current position. That's how I wound up here today. Someone heard me speak at the Florida Housing Conference last year and said, I like what you said. So that's how I got here today, okay?
That'd be me.
Oh, was it you? It was a year, that was so a year ago, Steve, okay? All right, so the one thing that I love to do is take a very complex thing like a Florida statute, right? That's where I started my career. And breaking it down so that normal people, like average human, not the architect, not the design, whatever, so that the average human understands it. I love doing that. So that's my space. And I've written articles about it, like what you see in front of you for Florida Planning Magazine. And I've talked at a bunch of different things like I'm doing today, okay? So I'm gonna get to the crossover into Live Local, although you're gonna wanna talk about that later. I'm just let me wrap it up. There, incidentally, so as a consultant, one of the first jobs I won now in the private sector was to review unincorporated Hillsborough County's comprehensive plan and land development code for their affordable housing density bonus. So I understood that space because I'd worked in that space in Bradenton and also with Florida statute at the state, right? So I was there to consult them on how to get their comp plan right, how to get those numbers right. And we took a pro forma based approach to it because the other thing they don't teach planners, unfortunately, in planning school is how the numbers work. They don't teach us that stuff. I had an interest in it, and I went out and learned about that through the Incremental Development Alliance. So I learned about it, I learned how to do the pro forma, and okay, so now I get it. So I'm trying to help them with that. So they had big policy goals that they wanted to meet, and the comp plan people wanted one thing, and the affordable housing people wanted another thing, and then the regulators who actually have to implement this stuff wanted something else. It was a really hard project, you guys, trying to herd all those cats, right? In the end, I recommended the same thing I usually recommend, that the numbers have to work financially, right? It has to fit the context of the area. There's all these things. And the LIHTC guys need something specific because they won't get funded unless it meets all the distance requirements of stuff. So I understood that too. And I'm trying to help. So it was an extremely frustrating process. The county couldn't get all the cats herded to agree on anything. And eventually they didn't pass it. We finished our report. They didn't use it. But it turned out a few months later that it didn't matter because the Live Local Act came out in 2023, right? And all the stuff I had recommended to the county, most of it, wound up in the act. And that's how I got here today.
It looks like I'm missing a slide, but that's okay.
They cheated you, didn't they?
So I know Steve and I think are the only architects on this panel, and Steve being the moderator, but just with that introduction, I think most people know me, Jeff Huber. I'm a principal at Brooks Scarpa and also teach at Florida Atlantic University. As my partners and my wife always like to say, I'm a legend in my own mind. But what I want to just kind of point out is how many of you know the Live Local Act as architects in here? You've heard about it, you've seen the opposition, and that's kind of what my first slide was all the opposition that we've seen, and it's pretty clear. And as we all know, we have the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. We have the term banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. We also have CAVE, citizens against virtually everything. And so the sensationalism is obvious and the solution is less so in affordable housing. And so, what we're trying to do is get to, where is the solution in these? And so, what I wanted to put up was this slide. I mean, it's a quote, and I'm not going to read the quote, but what I want to say is affordable housing should not be synonymous with poor design or high costs, or cost cutting even, for that matter. Housing should create environments that support well-being. They should foster community. They should respect the dignity of the residents. This legislation is about ensuring that hardworking Floridians can afford to live in the communities that they serve. These are even the neighborhoods that we all know well, but it's where our teachers, it's where our first responders, It's where our service workers live. It's everyone that deserves a chance to find affordable, quality housing close to where they work. And so that's the big challenge, and that's the goal, and that's why I really commend the state of Florida for putting forward this legislation. Next, at our firm, Brooks Scarpa, we've been working on a lot of affordable housing. Some of you may know some of these projects. These are across California, but also in Florida. We're engaging in the Live Local Act and being asked to do a lot of feasibility analysis. But one of the things that I can tell you is that affordable housing costs about 25% more than market rate housing. And why is that? We as architects usually get blamed, but it's not the architect's fault. These are usually regulations and other issues that are in there. For instance, if you look, the types of materials, the types of other things that we have to put in our project usually are far superior than that over the market rate housing. And I'm not going to get into every detail. We can kind of go into some of those conversations. Steven really told me I needed to stay within 3 to 5 minutes, and he was being serious. But I also want to kind of touch on, we just, in my role in teaching at Florida Atlantic University, last fall, we went into what we call reformatted for living, where we were looking at developing adaptive reuse models, leveraging some of the vacant office buildings and other buildings across the stock in Fort Lauderdale and South Florida in general. And we're actually able to use students that worked with the AIDS Healthcare Foundation to kind of leverage and look at the opportunities for adaptive reuse. And so, we developed a lot of different analysis looking at transit corridors, kind of looking at costs of living, looking at floodplains, which is something that we should also be thinking about in Florida. But we also kind of leveraged in looking at a mix of different typologies in there. And so these were just some of the student visions. I'm happy to kind of get into deeper dive and discuss some of these that students were looking at of how we could just kind of creatively adapt. And if anybody knows, on April 12th, we had one of, they call a 1,000-year storm event in 2023, where we had a rain bomb sitting over for 9 hours in Fort Lauderdale that dropped about 26 inches of rainfall, which had never been heard of in the history of the state of Florida before that time. We lost our city hall in Fort Lauderdale because a lot of their generators, electrical equipment, and everything was in a basement, which most of us know basements why in Florida. I don't know. But they decided they wanted to demolish this building and build a new one. We took it upon ourselves, and this is what I think the Academy can really serve well for our architectural profession, in saying, instead of demolishing this, the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. How can we adaptively preserve and reuse these? And so how do we convert, in this case, the city hall into a new use, into affordable, but really also mixing in occlusionary housing. And I think this is something that's critically important. We can't look at it as just siloing around affordable housing. And one of the reasons why I like the Live Local Act, and one of the things I hope we talk about, is the fact that I think it really is a truly inclusionary zoning type of practice that we need to look more and more, that we're not siloing just having affordable housing over here in market rate, but how do we begin to bridge those together? And so that's what I just want to present. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Can you guys hear me? All right. Yeah, beautiful last building. Appreciate everybody having me here today. Jake Zunneman, Senior Vice President of Development with Smith & Hensey. I've been in affordable housing for about 10 years. Appreciate the shout out from Catherine and inviting me to come. I think that was probably the second or third project I worked on in my career. So here's just a quick slide about our firm. We're located in Delray Beach. I work out of Miami, but we do developments across the state of Florida. And really what our niche is working with nonprofits. I think we represent about 20 plus housing authorities across the state, a lot of churches, and just basically other folks throughout the state of Florida who are stakeholders looking to activate land and do developments that make sense for the community. What I want to take this time in my quick 3 to 5 minutes is really just to focus on one particular development that we did as a company. It's called Lofts on Lemon. It's in Sarasota, Florida. There's some information on the slide about it, but to Catherine's point and probably what you'll hear about today, I mean, to do these developments, one of the toughest parts is that you are meeting with so many different stakeholders. You're making sure that you meet the goals of Florida Housing, and you're making sure that you're meeting the goals of maybe your local municipality. Then if that is a city, you're also meeting the goals of the county. And you have to make the numbers work. I mean, we're for-profit developers, so we can't just do deals that the numbers don't work at all. So how are you balancing that with beautiful design, but also making sure that GCs can come? And then because we work with nonprofits, some of our deals include a housing authority, a church, so I have to make sure that all their boards are happy as well. So it's definitely fun. And if you don't really, if you're not passionate about this work, then you'll be out quick, because it's way too many things that are going on to get from a raw piece of dirt to a finished project. So specifically, I wanted to focus on what's going to be Lofts on Lemon 2. This is Lofts on Lemon as it stands right now. As you can see, it's a 128-unit building, 5 stories. It's basically one-to-one parking. And then on the north side of this screen is basically this retention area and just kind of undeveloped land. And so that's actually where we're going to put Lofts on Lemon 2. As it pertains to Live Local, a lot of different fact patterns that are helping us as developers, whether it be height, parking. There's some new stuff coming out specific to property tax exemption and the kind of different land use agreements that we have to record against our properties. So I don't know if we're going to land on the development being this 8 stories, but I think what I like about Live Local is that at a minimum, between, again, the height, the parking, the density, and the tax exemption, at least it allows us to consider that. Lofts on Lemon 2 is basically taking what was just a 3-acre site that was going to house 128 units, and between what's going on at the city of Sarasota and some of their own zoning code, and then at the state, it's allowing us to basically reposition a site that we already have developed and get a whole nother 100 units there, affordable housing for families. And between working through, city staff, our architects, all those different stakeholders, I think what I like about Live Local most is that it's giving you that flexibility between playing with the height, playing with the parking, and then potentially now even this tax exemption based on some things that you as a developer are willing to commit to. And just to kind of give a last piece here about this specific development and kind of its accessibility to Live Local, I think probably what Jeff was mentioning with the NIMBYs and the bananas, there's some sites as a developer you look at it and you're like, okay, this is great, it fits our simple boxes for the state and maybe the city, but really this project's in the middle of nowhere. It's an industrial zone and there's nothing, this is pretty much like the heart of Sarasota, very close to the water, City Hall, et cetera. So I think it's one of those unique opportunities where between what's going on zoning wise and then also a lot of funds that we've been able to get from our municipal and nonprofit partners, you end up with a great development, and look forward to any questions that can provide some thoughts on, and I'm just happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. My name's Cormac Giblin, and I am here on the panel to give maybe the local government perspective on the implementation on how the Live Local Act is going. As Steve mentioned in my introduction, a few years ago, the Collier County embarked on creating what we call the Community Housing Plan. We brought in people and organizations from all over the county to give their perspectives. We also brought in the Urban Land Institute, the national think tank, to come to town. They did a one-week charrette, and some of the takeaways they had from Collier County was that they describe it as Mayberry meets Rodeo Drive. It's the kind of place where they said you could go to 7-Eleven and there'd be a Lamborghini and a Maserati sitting out front and think nothing of it. They encouraged our board to kind of reframe housing as an economic issue and not a social issue, because for so long there was pushback in, I'd say, a Republican county on social problems, but when you frame it as an economic issue, it kind of got some attention. They advised us that we should work on 5 core strategies: regulation and governance, increase, maintain, and preserve the supply of housing, enhance transportation options, increase wages, and in communication and engagement. One thing they said was that if we did not address the issue of cost burden, then at a minimum 11,000 more households would experience severe cost burden, paying more than 50% of their monthly income on house and rent than do today. What they left us with was a bunch of recommendations. On this page, there are about 35 individual recommendations, kind of divided into those 5 sectors of regulation and governments: increase, maintain supply, transportation, et cetera. The board decided to move forward with the ones that are in green. The ones in red, they decided we're not even going to go down that road. But what's interesting is the ones that I've kind of boxed in yellow, those are kind of the foreshadowing of what became the Live Local Act. I don't think it's a coincidence that Senator Passidomo lives in Naples. Her and her aides attended many of these meetings. They were at these presentations when we were doing this in around 2018, 2019. So what we took was many of those same ideals that the Live Local Act had, we were starting to lay the foundation for already. When the ULI left, they kind of threw a parting shot over the bow of our county commission and said what was abundantly clear to the panel was that action and implementation were crucial to creating sustainable solutions. What they heard in their week in Naples was that the issue had been talked about for years, for decades, but rarely did pen get to paper and concrete get to ground and things get done. So in this prelude to Live Local out of the housing plan, we were on the road to creating new definitions, which aligns with the missing middle part of the Live Local Act. We were updating our affordable housing density bonus, providing greater densities. We were already on track to streamline commercial to residential conversions by right, as is allowed in Live Local. We were increasing density in our activity centers by 56%, and we were developing a transit-oriented design program to increase density along transit routes and bus stops. With that, we brought specific growth management plan and land development code changes to our board. And these are the ones that are really, we'll call it Live Collier, since Live Local is already enacted, but you'll see that there are some reasons why we're continuing down this path. We didn't just give up and say, oh, the legislature took care of it. We don't need to go down this road anymore. I think there's some benefit to developing a local program as well. So the first initiative was to allow commercial properties to be rezoned by right to affordable housing. The second was to allow density in our activity centers, which are in the map on the right. All the little red dots is basically where anywhere there's a crossroads of two major roads in Collier County, we deem that an activity center. We're going to allow 25 units to the acre for mixed housing development in those areas. And the third one, the transit-oriented design, again, we're going to be allowing 25 units to the acre as long as your property touches a bus route, which again is almost every major road in Collier County. What we found is that as we tried to implement the Live Local program as it came from the legislature, there were some roadblocks. Number one, our board didn't quite like the legislature telling them what to do. They didn't like not having that local control, so they interpreted the statute, I'd say, in maybe one of the most strict ways that it could be interpreted, which means that rather than 92 units to the acre, which is our highest residential density that you can find in Collier County, they said, no, we're not going to take density that's been derived through a planned unit development. We're going to take only what's allowed in our code, which is 25 units to the acre. So that right there kind of lessened the impact that Live Local could have in Naples. They also said, we're not going to let you use it in commercial areas of PUDs. About 98% of Collier County has been developed through PUDs. There's very, very little straight zoning. They said, no, we're only going to let this occur in straight zoning. And then they also said, in those development standards, we're going to make you use some very strict development standards, which are 50% of your height, front and rear, which kind of makes it difficult to develop. You can give someone all the density and all the height they want, but if you can't meet the development standards, it doesn't quite work. So the process in Collier was we had developers give us a letter of interest, a zoning verification letter, and we have gotten quite a bit of lookers. I'll call them tire kickers. And so all of these folks came in, and they said, I want to know what my restrictions and what my allowabilities would be on these projects for Live Local. And you can see, of the ones that were authorized, only 2 have gone forward thus far for about 528 units. The first one is a project called Ecos on Collier. It's a Live Local application. They're doing 160 units. This is a traditional LIHTC project. They are doing extremely low income, and very low income. And they're also partnering with the county to have us buy the land for them using our 1 penny cent surtax. Another one that came in, this is not a LIHTC development. They're doing 368 rental units, of which, like Live Local requires, 40% will be rentals for 120% AMI. Both of these developments are in the site plan review stages right now. So some of the key takeaways about implementation, at least in Collier County, is that the development standards can make or break the project. Like I mentioned, you can give someone all the density and height that they want, but if they can't make it fit, it doesn't fit. And you have to also keep an eye on that most of these vacant commercial or industrial properties are not set up to be residential properties. They're strip malls, they are fronting major highways, they're shallow, they're long, and not quite the best when you're trying to fit parking and water management, open space, and setbacks. And Live Local is really only as beneficial as an individual local government chooses it to be. There's still plenty of room for interpretation in there. I know that perhaps the intent of the legislature was to take the NIMBY out of the equation and just have these go through, but trust me, there's a lot of gray there for each individual municipality or county to interpret it however they feel like. So a locally developed and supported approach may provide greater gains, and that's why we're still going ahead with the plans that we developed through our housing plan. That's
great. All right, well, I do not have a presentation, so can I just go there? Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. I had quite a day of travel here. Took over 12 hours to get here from Los Angeles yesterday, but I'm here on time, just a little tired. I'll give a little background about me in a moment, but I did just want to first comment on Jake's project and how envious I am of a $250,000 per unit development cost, where in Los Angeles, a similar affordable housing development nowadays is almost always at least $600,000 per unit. And we have the same issue as Jeffrey mentioned, where affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing, is consistently $100,000, $150,000 more per unit than a similar, unsubsidized, mostly market rate or mixed income building. Like Catherine, it's Catherine, right?
Yes.
Okay. I also am very interested in, and this is kind of why I ended up at UCLA despite not really having an academic background. I'm very interested in helping non-experts in all of these housing issues understand what the experts know. And often I am not one of those experts on these issues. So this is where our podcast comes in, and a lot of the work we do is not just trying to understand how policies work and what is effective and what's not, but also get the word out to people who can actually do something with that information and not just leave it behind paywalled journal articles that no one reads for all intents and purposes. So I sort of have the same interest in kind of helping planners understand what developers go through, but also helping developers understand what planners go through. I think we could do with a lot more understanding on both sides, probably have a lot better outcomes overall. And I think that kind of comes from my background where to start. I'm gonna go over more of this in the other room in just about an hour, but I'll just say, I dropped out of high school, I worked at UPS and Comcast for a while, went back to school, got a biochemistry degree, worked in a lab for a while, and then came to LA from Seattle and kind of started my career in urban planning and have worked at all kinds of different places, public and private since then. And also grew up in a family that was like very strongly conservative and liberal depending on the person. And so I'm just like all over the map, and I think that's why I'm so interested in everything and really at least try to understand where other people are coming from, even if I disagree with them strongly. On the Live Local bill or act specifically though, I'll just say a few things quickly because the rest of this time we'll talk about it more. One is, I've kind of become a scholar of state-level housing reform preemption, especially on supply-related issues, just because this really interests me, and I've come to the conclusion that there is really no alternative. If we rely on every individual city to try to solve our housing problems themselves, we're not going to solve our housing problems because most cities are not actually interested in solving them. They do not see housing affordability problems as really a problem for the most part, or at least not one that they necessarily want to take on. And I think a benefit of state reform, aside from it just requiring everyone to contribute, is it gives the cities who are concerned that, well, what if I do everything I possibly can, but none of my neighbors do? It's not actually going to make much of a difference if I'm 10% of my metro area and the other 90% are just continuing to go on as they were. This eliminates that problem, and I don't really think there's any other way to get that kind of collaboration other than to mandate it at some level. Last thing I'll say, and then we can get to the conversations. All these bills always get painted by opponents as one size fits all. It's true to some extent, but I would just note that those critiques are often coming from people who live in cities and who support the policy of having a city that is 80 to 90% single family homes and nothing else. So we already have a one-size-fits-all system in most cities, and it's a really bad one-size-fits-all system. So if we have to have a one-size-fits-all, maybe we could have one that's a little bit better than the one we've got now.
Well, that's a good segue into my first question. There's unintended consequences to this law. Having dealt with it myself in my practice and evaluated it on some of the boards that I sit on, we've quickly determined the unintended consequences. And I believe a lot of those unintended consequences was the one-size-fits-all. Florida is a very diverse state. We've got urban areas, we've got your Miami, your Tampa, your Orlando. You've got suburban areas, greenfield areas, gated communities like us in Naples, and then you've got very rural areas. So I think this legislation was one size fits all, but I think it doesn't. And that leads me to my first question, and it's really to Catherine and Jeffrey. As design professionals working in this housing space, what do you see as the opportunities, first of all, of this legislation, and what are the obstacles or the unintended consequences of using it?
I can speak to the obstacle.
I'll speak to the opportunity then.
Okay.
Think quick.
Me go first? Okay. So the thing that has thrown the regulators, the planners, the planner regulators, into a kind of a fit is the fact that the Live Local Act did not address the thing that we've all been trained to do over 20 years. And that means, it used to be in the statute, but the Growth Management Act kind of got butchered, and that's more technical information than you needed to know. But it didn't say, so there used to be a policy that you had to put in your comprehensive plans. Every local government was required to have them. That you don't put people in the coastal high hazard area. Now, I have to explain the difference between the two coastal high hazard areas. You all are designers, so you're working in the space of the coastal high hazard area that is the velocity zone, right? That's the FEMA one, that's the building code one. Planners are working in the growth management one. Why the legislature named the same thing that are two very different things makes it hard on everybody. But for growth management purposes, the coastal high hazard area is the area that could be inundated by storm surge for a Category 1 storm. So planners are thinking about the people, the needs of the people. Do you put the most vulnerable people in a very vulnerable area? Because the coastal high hazard area also includes your coastal high hazard area, the FEMA one. It also could include sea level rise areas that have been mapped. It may or may not coincide with your flood zones, your special flood hazard areas. So planners are thinking, okay, what do we do about the people? These are vulnerable people. The thing is, there are some local governments that their entire city is in the coastal high hazard area. And they, of course, have what we called during COVID essential workers, right? and that it was somebody different in every jurisdiction. Who are the people that need to keep the wheels, right? Keep the wheels on the wagon, right? Restaurant workers for COVID, right? Restaurant workers, we needed food delivery. We still needed someone to come pick up the trash. We still needed someone to teach the kids, and those are the people that need affordable housing. And the folks that had to show up to a physical place and still do a job, well, I got to sit at home and work from home and take a break. And that was wonderful for me. Some people still had to show up at work, and they need a place to live. And people in beach communities particularly, this is where it gets hard. They're right, there's more wealthy people than not. Take Palm Beach, for instance. This is a great example. Lots of wealthy people here. They don't want those people living here, right? The Live Local Act makes it possible to deal with the YIMBY stuff, right? And so if someone at the city of Palm Beach cares enough about this, or someone like Jake wants to come in and do a project, they don't have to deal with that stuff. They don't have to deal with the NIMBYs. They don't have to deal with the city's stupid regulations that don't make a project work out, right? That is the great thing about the act. But the planners are obsessing about this one thing we were all trained to do for 20 years in the statute that says you don't put people in the coastal high hazard area. It's ingrained in our brains. And so we are very frustrated trying to figure that out. That's the shortcoming. No one like me sat down and told everybody all the things I just told you, the story of why this is hard, right? That's it.
Yeah, okay, opportunities, man, okay. I mean, the opportunities that we've seen, I mean, there's obviously affordable housing is a huge need. So we've been seeing a lot of what Live Local is trying to do is streamline the process for delivery of affordable housing. I mean, under its premise, but it's also trying to provide financial incentives. But I think the other thing that's happened is what I'm excited by is there's developers that are knocking on people's doors, especially I'm assuming a lot of us out there, that we may have never even had as an opportunity before. So being innovative and kind of thinking about affordable housing in the future is something that this Live Local Act, I think, has opened the door for opportunities that didn't currently exist. Now, I guess I will talk about some opposition. A little bit down where we are in Miami Beach, I'm sure most of you heard one of the biggest issues that we get a lot of feedback from is in historic preservation districts or historic districts where there's a lot of these opportunities that exist under the Live Local that may have some unintended consequences. And that's one of the bigger challenges that we're still trying to look through. And I find, again, I'm going to just kind of go back to this and I'm going to quote my partner, Larry, because what he says here is what we really need is a shift from an emphasis on building efficiency to policy proficiency. And I think, this Live Local is the first step to, I think, what's a good policy. It's not perfect, and we're seeing this now post 1 year into it. And I think we're going to still kind of move that forward because one of the things that I like about Live Local is we're now seeing it's not the architect at fault for why affordable housing doesn't exist. We're starting to see it's less about the building construction being the scapegoat here, and it's more about the policies and these programs that are becoming more of the challenge to getting affordable housing, which to me, again, I don't want to belittle, I don't want to say the architect isn't always at fault because, again, we do have our designs, but it can't be the 100% of the reason why some of these projects are over budget. Maybe 10% I'll take. I don't know how many, would want to take more on, but, I think that's where we're going to have to start to see is these outdated policies that really make affordable housing unaffordable is going to be the next step I think that Live Local should really be taking on. And so there's the opportunities and some of the challenges that I would say.
Well, I think you're right. Us who work in this space always knew it was policy. It was hindering the development policy and economics and the economics of it. But I don't sense the architects get so much blame. It's the developers that get the blame. They're making profit and they're gouging everyone. So, what do you see the opportunities and the shortcomings of Live Local, Jake?
Sure. So, I mean, as it pertains to the opportunities, what I would say is, as an affordable housing developer, we're always going to be up against a lot of problems. So that's number one. If you get into the business for any other reason, then it's going to be short-lived. And so the opportunities for us is that I'm seeing developments right now, City of Tampa that has some industrial, but that happens to be by a Walmart and other apartments that I say I never would have evaluated that deal ever. But here's an opportunity that I think I can actually go through a streamlined process. There's a site that I'm looking at in Cape Coral that we're working on that has some kind of moratorium going on with it because of a PUD that was in place in the area, but because of Live Local, they feel confident, we can actually still do apartments. So I think it's opening up a lot of just different types of development that otherwise weren't opening to us. And I think a little bit what Jeff's saying is that I am constantly dealing with landowners and people that want to figure out how to do developments. And especially living in Miami for quite a while now, it's been very unrealistic prices. And if when I started in this industry in 2014, 2015, I could buy a piece of dirt for $1 million, now it's 10 million bucks. I did a development in Fort Lauderdale that I bought a piece of property for $3.5 million to do 100 units. And 2 years later, the property literally adjacent to the north, exact same zoning, et cetera, sold for 17 million. So I don't have an ability to compete with those folks anymore. But what I am finding is that because the market right now is so challenging, whether I end up doing deals with those folks or not, those private developers who otherwise were just going to do a market rate and are like, why am I going to do affordable or why am I going to do this? They are now calling me every other day to see how can we JV or how do I make a project work. And so in so much as some of those developers, maybe they're only building to 120% AMI, whereas I'm building to 60% AMI. And maybe 120% AMI today is market rate or even better. It's not going to be market rate 30 years from now or 50 years from now. So it's getting those folks who are not just the affordable housing community to actually look and say, okay, this is a real thing. I can't make my numbers work anymore. So I'm going to figure out how to make these affordable or workforce or missing middle deals work because that's the only way I'm going to get things done. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most happy in seeing about Live Local. It's getting the folks that aren't in our space to try to come figure out how they can do it in a meaningful way, which isn't just throwing money at an impact fee or, something that just, it's not going to be meaningful long term. So.
Well, I've found that there are clients that basically did not spell affordable housing 2 years ago, or are now coming saying, well, how can I get involved in this? You just mentioned, that other development part of the market. What's the advantage to them? Why would they be coming to us, and what is the advantage to partnering with someone like you?
Yeah, so I think the big advantage, right, is that we have a lot of financial tools at our disposal that we have access to that theoretically you might not. I'm yet to activate this program, but Penny for Pinellas has been out for quite some time. And it's usually been very difficult for me to make a deal work because the amount of money mixed with what we can do in our rent structure, it won't work. But there are other developers that I know that call me, and for them, it will, because all of a sudden, this soft gap money that they're able to get from the local municipality is helping fill whatever gap that they have. I think on the tax exemption piece, that's a huge one. I don't know how Cormac feels about that and how much, some of the officials like not getting taxes for these new developments. But if you don't pay taxes for a property, your ability to raise debt and therefore finance a project might be in the $2 to $10 million range that you're able to pick up. And I think, one item in particular that I look at a lot, and if I was an elected official, right, is there are some of these developments, like I said, getting built in areas where 120% AMI might be the market, or it's even greater than the market. So really that developer today is not really giving up a whole lot, but they're receiving these advantages of soft money, tax exemption, et cetera. But I think that's okay, because as long as they are being forced to record land use restriction agreements and other covenants that don't allow them to just not be affordable over the next 30 years, that scale is going to flip real quick. Right now they're getting an advantage, but in 5 years, that's going to be maybe the one community in that market that 120% AMI is not even close to market. You'd have to be 140, 160, et cetera. And so basically those folks are coming into this arena because they're saying, well, I'm not giving up that much today, and I'm receiving a potential lot of financial incentives just to be able to get my deal done and keep going.
That's an interesting concept that I've never heard talked about. And what you're really saying is that though in those specific markets, you're creating a legacy.
100%.
5-10 years out, that will be affordable, and it's sustainable for the long haul. That's an interesting perspective that I have not heard anyone talk about on Live Local yet. So, Cormac, you talked a little bit about it on your slides, and I know you have been working with several forums and stakeholder groups to try to determine the implications on the local development and how we can use and maximize this. And I think I'm hearing you say that you've decided maybe we have a better solution than Live Local. Could you talk to us a little bit more? I think you just called it Collier, Live Collier.
Live Collier.
Could you put a little more meat on the bones on that? What is that about, and how are you going about doing it? And what issues are you addressing to fine-tune or to adjust Live Local?
Well, if there's one thing that has come out of Live Local so far, at least in Collier, is that the conversation has gone to a level where it's never been before. We're having regular meetings of community groups, nonprofits, think tanks, builders, developers, architects, coming together to say, how can we make this work? Where's the missing pieces? Where gaps do we need to fill? And is there a better way to do this? And those are happening regularly now. It's I put the list on earlier. I call them tire kickers because there was a while right after Live Local came out that we at local government, in the growth management department, were meeting almost daily with, hey, I have a piece of property. How does it work here? What can I do here? What can I do here? And while everyone was jazzed and very excited in the beginning, I think reality kind of set in and said, well, you don't have room for your parking, or you don't have room for your stormwater, and that site is too shallow. You can only go up 2 stories and 3 stories at the most. And so as the face of reality started to show itself, that's where the opportunities have come up for us to take the things that we've been working on and tweak them at this point to develop our own set of development standards for Live Collier. Our own set of ways to look at it to make it work, and having all those same people in the room that the bottom line has to pencil out. Someone has to want to invest their own time, treasure, and talent into it to make it work in the end. As planners, sometimes we sit up here and we set these lofty goals, but without understanding how it works on the bottom, you can make all the plans you want, but nothing's going to get built. Yeah. And that's the stage we're at now, is tweaking we've already gone through the first set of growth management plan changes to allow these densities and these development standards. We're now this summer, this fall, enacting the implementing land development regulations to kind of give developers another option than Live Local. Again, like I mentioned in my remarks, Live Local is not looked at favorably by our county commission. Now, they don't have a lot of say other than saying where can you do it and where can't you, and so they've been very strict in that. But when it comes and it becomes one of their own regulations, all these growth management plan amendments and land development regulations have been adopted 5-0, without even public comment. So when it's a homegrown solution, I think it can go a lot further.
Well, I've heard, talking to legislators, that one of the intents, and I think somebody mentioned this was an anti-NIMBY legislation. They figured if the state gave local municipalities the opportunity to say, look, the state is making me do it. My hands are tied. And it seems to maybe have backfired because municipalities are saying, you're taking my home rule away. So do you think in your county that by localizing it and incorporating it into your land development code, you're going to be able to be more effective than if you use the straight out Live Local?
I think it's going to be more effective in 2 ways. Number one, that way. that our local government can feel that it's their own rules that they're moving forward with. But also, I think we're writing a better piece of legislation. We're writing something that targets the incomes where the needs are, specifically at this time in Collier, and we're writing the land development regulations that make it fit. A one-size-fits-all, while it has to fit the whole state, again, putting those high-rise, high-density developments on a 1-acre postage stamp doesn't quite work in Collier County and in Naples. So it's the twofold of having the homegrown solution and the mechanism to get it built.
Mm-hmm.
Can I pitch Live Local Collier?
Oh, nice.
Local Collier.
They might actually hate that there.
Yeah.
It's just referring to Live Local, but it sounds nice.
Trademark.
That being said, Shane, you've got a national perspective on this, and you alluded to it in your presentation. What impresses you about this act, and what do you look at it and say, this is not going to work?
Well, I wanted to say this in the intro. I think this is the most significant upzoning bill in the country, just on paper at least. I'm actually curious. I tried to find this. I don't know if this is reported anywhere, how many units have been proposed or permitted. I imagine not many permitted at this point. It's only been about a year. But I'm very curious what the actual effect has been. But around the country, many places, especially Western states, not because they're particularly great, frankly, but I think actually just because the crisis is so bad there and has been for so long that they've needed to act sooner. But they've mostly done, legalizing ADUs everywhere, maybe 2 or 4 units on a parcel. Even then, a lot of times building those 4 units is prohibitively difficult because you have to subdivide it, or you have to have owner occupancy, or all these different rules that are associated with it. California has a commercial zoning bill as well that passed in 2022, but it has, it's only really significant density along corridors. It requires prevailing wage and contractors paying their health insurance, and what else is there on there? The contractors have to be enrolled or participating in an apprenticeship program. There's just all these costs and compliance and everything, such that I know very few projects or developers that are using the program. And that's the story of a lot of these policies. And it seems like, just looking at the bill and I've at least seen that there are many proposals for projects, it seems like this really is designed to work. I think if I could point to something I have a little bit of concern about, I think the property tax exemption worries me a little bit relative to the affordability. To get even a 75% property tax reduction, which I think is what's contemplated on those units that are 120% or below, I know property taxes are pretty low in Florida relative to most states as a rate, but still, that is a significant amount of money. And as others have said, in many cases, 120% AMI is basically market rate. That's even true in California. So I think they may be wasting a little money there that could go toward other purposes. If nothing else, I would be interested in at least exploring kind of right-sizing what the property tax exemption is, or really tying it to rents or something, where it's, how much are you really discounting your rents relative to market rate and tying it to that? Portland, Oregon has an interesting inclusionary zoning program, the only one I'm actually aware of that is funded, where you have to provide on-site affordable units, and we're talking 80%, 60% AMI, really deeply discounted, subsidized units in unsubsidized projects, mixed income projects. But now they offer you a property tax rebate for up to 10 years, and I believe there's kind of a simple study that determines how to actually determine the amount, present value and all that kind of taken into account. So I think those are two things. There's many. I did want to comment on a few things just briefly because it is relevant to this as well, but certainly this bill, like all others, is imperfect, and what I've seen in California, what I've seen in many other states is the legislature has to really be committed to returning to these issues year after year after year. And the fact that you already have this glitch bill passed is a good sign that they are committed to doing that. The fact, it doesn't have to end there, obviously. They can pass more next year and the year after that, and they can do different things that might target different kinds of housing options. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that it is just important to pass something at a certain point because you need something to build off of, and also the people fighting for this stuff need a win to stay committed and continue fighting for further reform. Last thing I'll say, this idea that, we especially hear this in California and Los Angeles, San Francisco, how developers will never build affordable housing without giving them a bunch of money. And I think Live Local is kind of a proof against that, but again, 120% isn't really affordable. In Los Angeles, though, we had this kind of conflation, unintentional basically, of multiple policies that allow developers to sort of not comply with most development standards if 80% of the units are at 80% AMI and 20% are at 120% AMI. And the projects are by right, it's just very straightforward, and they can be built in many different places. And there are thousands of units being proposed, all unsubsidized. Also affordable, subsidized developers are taking advantage of this as well. But thousands of unsubsidized projects are being proposed. Some have already been permitted and are underway, under construction. And I think it really does go to show that if you have the right incentives in place, developers if it's profitable, and if it's more profitable than the alternatives, they're happy to build deed-restricted housing, even at somewhat lower AMIs.
Interesting. Again, Jeff and Catherine, you're both design professionals. We have a whole audience of such out here. What do you see our role as design professionals, as architects and city planners, in promoting, moving, modifying this piece of legislation, and in general in the affordable housing space, and making it much easier and much more productive? What's our role?
I think just like Jake did with me in taking the time to explain the process of getting these projects approved, architects have to explain to planners and regulators what your design responsibility is, and explaining that all the stuff that you have to meet. Because a planner will, in their minds, will just get frustrated if someone doesn't take the time to really explain it to them. The numbers are relentless, right? You're not going to build a project if the numbers don't work. But a planner's going to sit there and roll their eyes and go, they just want money. Well, duh, we all need money to live, right? We all have to buy groceries, we all have to pay rent or a mortgage and a car payment and all that stuff. But the planner, the regulator whose job it is to look at this book and tell you what the rules are, that person in government is the person you all need to connect with. Because they're looking at the book and going, but the rule says this. The rule says this, you guys, the rule says this. Your job is to be calm and friendly and nice and think to yourself, okay, this is a planner, I'm talking to a planner. What do I say to this person to get through to them that this stuff doesn't all fit on a lot, you guys? Planners aren't designers. That's another unfortunate thing. Well, there's some planners that are designers, right? There's very few planners that are actually designers. So until you, and I did this actually at the Florida APA conference last year, I brought in some of the Incremental Development Alliance folks, and we did a hands-on session with planners. And it said in the session that drawing is not required for this, right? But we gave them a list of typical rules you have to follow, a designer would have to follow. You have this much impervious space, you need this many parking spaces, and this, and this. And the planner who's thinking about policy and the feel-good things, yes, we all agree missing middle housing would be a great thing. And then we handed them a little site plan that they had to figure out. And we said, okay, it has to be Your frontage has to be this, the parking number has to be this, the drive aisle has to be this, like all the rules that you all deal with, right? And the planners were tasked with just kind of drawing something on a page informally, trying to figure out. And then they were tasked with figuring out what regulations would have to change in the list that we gave them that were typical things that all cities have, because some planners are lazy and they copy and paste from somewhere else and it doesn't actually work for you. That's a whole other story. So they're tasked at this particular thing and they're trying to draw it out. And everyone held up their paper at the end. 150 people are like, I'm done. And we walk over and go, well, okay, so they drew the house, they drew the building in exactly the right space. It was 10 feet from this side, it was 20 feet from the front, all that stuff. They didn't draw they drew the parking spaces, because, they had that information too. There's this many parking spaces, and they drew those what they were supposed to be. What they forgot was the drive aisle. And so we're like, okay, you did a great job. You did everything that we told you to do. Except now, how does that car turn into the driveway and get to those parking spaces? And then they look at it, they go, oh my God, I'm so dumb. Those are the people that you have to work with at the city every day just to get a permit, just to get a stupid permit. And you're having to explain it to those people. So be calm and cool and nice. Don't piss off the planner, right? The regulatory guy that's just looking at the book. I'm telling you how to do it. You just have to explain to them how it doesn't all physically work. And they're not going to know that because they don't live in your space.
I saw a really good version of this just as like a blog post from probably more than a decade ago that was explaining the Seattle six-pack, as it's known. This like 3 townhomes kind of oriented perpendicular, or 3 by 3 with a driveway in the middle, perpendicular to the street. Everyone hated them, but they were kind of all over the place. And, people ask why. And someone just went through, clearly an architect or something, just went through and explained, like, okay, start with a parcel. We're going to walk through every single one of the regulations that determines what I can build. And at the end, you were left with nothing except a Seattle six-pack. It was the only thing,
That's right.
The only thing left in that envelope was exactly that. And I think that kind of thing is so valuable if you can get, planners to look at it.
And the planners get frustrated by that, and they default to, they just want to make money.
Yeah.
Well, Catherine, do you see, rather than locking horns with the planners and the architects, do you see the potential for locking arms and cooperating to go to the Cormacs of the world here and say, we need to change these regulations because they don't work?
Right.
Maybe that's a role that we play as architects and planners, not the bad guy, Cormac, but you're the guy who may have.
I've got the rule book.
Clout.
Well, yeah, because first of all, good job getting six-pack in twice. But one of the things that I just want to say is that this is where you're making a great point, Steve, is that architects need to get a little smarter about the process. We need to understand that 70% of the design of our projects is already done in the first 10%, usually before we're even hired.
Exactly.
And we need to get more involved in that part of the process. And so that's why, we always think as architects we're at the center of the process, and that then we go to the regulators and then we go to the developer. But we need to understand that sometimes, especially in affordable housing, these projects have 10 to 12 different financiers coming into this, that there's it's a wicked problem. And that if we got smarter about the front end and the back end and actually figured out how to expand our services around that, I think architects would be better situated and kind of getting out of sometimes our own ways.
I don't know about you, but I don't know how many times I've had a client come in with a complete site plan and blocking out where the housing goes, done by the civil engineer. And they go, well, it's oriented wrong. But they've already spent tens of thousands of dollars to get to that point and just expect you to draw up the plans.
Right.
So I think that may be a communication between the other stakeholders and the development community, that we need to be involved earlier,
Right.
and we need to promote those services, that we are capable, we're problem solvers early on. We should be part of that team.
And I think to Shane's point too, in the conversation about the six-pack, the Portland, is there's typologies that usually work in these cities and these pattern books that our grandparents knew, and this is why we see repeated typologies across the city. And that's the other kind of challenge, is that, if we as architects start to work with those city municipalities and other, you'll start to find a common thread through just ubiquitous lot types and others. And so those are some of the patterns that we need to understand and work with the CarMax of the world.
Well, Carmack, you're deeply involved in doing that exactly now. How difficult was it to commandeer all of the stakeholders who are involved with Live Local and with affordable housing in general to come to the table and not be confrontational with each other, but cooperative? And how did that happen?
It happened with the help of a lot of people. I'll start with that. It happened with some new nonprofits that were formed in town to specifically be kind of the one-stop shop of everything housing. That for years, that was the county. And I think there was a realization that maybe we shouldn't be the best ones being the public face of trying to change the conversation. And so we helped out with the formation of some new nonprofits in town and helped out with our expertise with all of the growth management and design professionals. We had that meeting that you described with everyone in the same room and a blank piece of paper, and we said, this is what works and this doesn't. And at the end of it is what we're working on now. So it takes time and it takes some patience to continue to corral the cats and get them all in the same room and talking the same language, but that's kind of where we are now.
When do you think the politicians and the leaders in the community are more susceptible to listening to those groups than they are to their own staff?
I think so, yes. I think if someone else says it, other than a county staffer, maybe they'll believe it more, even if I wrote their notes.
As someone coming from the West Coast, I heard this before. What's the definition of an expert? Someone you pay to come from another city and tell your superior what you already have been telling them for years. Kind of what I'm here to do, I suppose. But
I think we've all been in that position
yes,
at one point in time.
I mean,
You're never
I
a prophet in your own town.
Something that architects, I think, are uniquely suited to do in this domain is, the reality is that these designs that people don't like, that just keep getting repeated over and over, fixing them almost always requires relaxing some kind of development standard. It's never like we're going to tighten this here and tighten that, or maybe balance one tighten with a loosening. It's usually just like you got to let up a little bit, and that's always people are going to hear that as this thing I hate is just going to get bigger. It's going to get closer to my house. It's going to get whatever. And so I think we need architects, and this is a challenge because you can't do this pro bono or anything necessarily, but actually showing what these alternatives look like so people can understand that the thing you're proposing to, the reason you're proposing to relax these standards, these specific standards, is so you can build this thing that in most cases everyone agrees looks better than what we're building right now. And again, I think I wish I had that skill to be able to visualize that for people.
Shane, just a plug for tomorrow, for a session on Saturday in Session W. Mike Pyatak from Oakland, who's very prolific in affordable housing design. He has a wonderful presentation that takes you from 4 units to the acre to 65 units to the acre, and it's cozy, it's nice, you'd want to live there even at 65. And I've heard him speak to a crowd of very conservatives saying, that's not 65 units per acre.
Yeah.
Hell, you're lying to me. So I think you're right, and that's something we as architects can do, just hold up the image.
Yeah. You need to show people what
it is.
Are proposing, and
And often it's not necessarily the structure and the building, and I think Goldberg said that this morning. It's not only the building, it's what that building may represent and who lives in it. So we find that it's not the roof, it's who's under the roof that may.
Design can only do so much, but it does help.
Exactly. Back to the developer again. Okay, you've been dealing with the Live Local. What other incentives would you love to see from a community to layer on top of Live Local to make your job easier and the numbers work better for you?
It's a great question. I mean, I think probably the biggest thing that's at a premium right now is just land, So I think, so often there are pieces of land that, a nonprofit or a municipality or whoever has access to already, and there's just kind of a lot of thought processes about what can or can't happen with it. And I think that's probably one of the biggest items. So what I like that Live Local did, and I don't know how much effect it's had or not, is it basically put out there for all the municipalities to, come up with this inventory list of land that should be accessible for affordable housing. And I think, probably to what, Shane and Cormac are talking about, I mean, just not every municipality is created equal. So even if, that's kind of what the statute is asking, then how that information is portrayed and what those, land opportunities are, et cetera, are not necessarily accessible, depending on if you're in a Miami versus Hillsborough versus Palm Beach. And so I think that's probably the biggest one. It's already in there, and it's just a question of how does that get out more to the development community, and then what is the rigmarole or red tape that we or anyone needs to go through to actually.
You're basically saying if you take the cost of land out of the equation, everything else can follow.
I think that's a huge one. And I mean, one of the biggest elements, I heard Jeff mention it, and, definitely when I worked with Catherine, like the form-based code that she had in Bradenton made it very easy. As a developer, one of our biggest issues is that, and I always say this to all the architects that I work with, is like, oh, this project, I need to make sure that, the folks that we're dealing with on a local level, that it's a question of when and not if. And so Jeff is like, oh, I'm doing all these feasibility studies for people. Like, I have a lot of architects do that as well. And I'm always telling them, and then the planners that I'm working with, I'm like, I want to understand your process, because if the question is just when, right, meaning, yeah, I have to go through this meeting, and then this meeting, and then this meeting, I'm cool with that. But if the question is if, right, and I've developed a 40-unit housing in Illinois, where I went through 9 months of hearings, and then it still was, basically 700 people telling me, hey, we're against you, and it was 3 village community hearings. Like, that's a problem for me, because at that point, I've invested maybe $1 million worth of time, and all that needs to happen is the elected officials need to say, you know what, I don't think you have enough parking, and for that reason, we're done here. And that's a problem for us. So if we have land that is accessible to us, that we're not putting that cost in, because don't forget, right, a lot of these deals, we also have a gun to our head from whoever owns that land, because they don't care. They're just like, why haven't you paid me my money yet? You've had this under contract for 2 years. Why haven't you closed yet? Oh, well, I had to do all these other things. So I think that would be a big fact pattern, and, would help us to push other elements along,
So what you're saying, in addition to the land and maybe some subsidy, it's certainty that might help you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Florida Housing did this year, which is really interesting, is that the way Florida works, Florida Housing is allocated the credits, and then they allocate it as they see fit amongst all these different requests for application. And Miami-Dade is basically one of the most sought after, it just happened recently. And basically, they have enough money to fund 3 deals, and this year I think they got like 60 applications. So that's not a great hit rate if you're a developer, or we're just all vying for that same tax credits. And this year in particular, they said, you know what, we have a new goal. It's called Permit Ready Goal. And basically, if anybody can submit a deal where, I don't remember the exact nuance, but it's kind of like if you can close your deal within 90 days after getting this award, which basically means you have site plan approval, you have full building permits, you are ready to go, then you're just going to go to the top of the list effectively. And it was very, it was obviously a contentious issue in the development community, like, well, who's doing this? How are we going to do this? Because that's a lot of money to actually try to get to that place without any certainty. And so anyways, those 60 applications came in. I was like, for sure there's going to be one group. And the amount of groups that submitted under that goal were 0. So I think it's really interesting, but that's a big fact pattern for us is, like, if we know something is out there for us, we will go do it. But if it's all based on a lottery or based on a final hearing, that's a real struggle to put that much capital into a project for anybody.
Can I ask a question of Jake about this land issue?
Yeah.
Because this has been another thing I thought might be sort of a shortcoming of Live Local. And, like, to be clear, I think it's a great bill overall. But the fact that it is just commercial and industrial land, I think traditionally commercial and industrial land is just more valuable than residential land. And so maybe the fact that commercial is struggling these days is kind of resetting things a little bit. But is there a lot of land that's like, you could build a great project here, but the owner is just going to hold out for a commercial builder because they'll get more money from them? And so the fact that it's just limited to those locations and no residential areas at all is really holding it back potentially.
I
Or is that not true at all?
No, I think it really just depends on the municipality. I mean, I can't speak to like what's going on in California or the rest of the country, but Florida, for better or for worse, right? Like we've just seen crazy pricing here, like craziness, and I think throughout the entire state. So one of our fact patterns that we have is that when Live Local actually came out, I had a deal I was working at Miami that it was kind of a commercial, mixed use, et cetera, and they wanted $5 million for it. And then Live Local came out, and then they wanted 15. And I'm like, what is that based on? They're like,
It's an unintended consequence of Live Local. Yeah.
the previous zoning I had, we could do 200, but now I could do 1,200. And I'm like, yeah, but who's going to do that in this area based on that? Well, I could do it now. Yeah. It's kind of what Cormac's saying. So I think some of that reality is coming back, but it may open more doors, to your point, if there are
Shane, that leads
a few more zoning
to
codes.
my last question that I had here. This is maybe more to the designers and planners. In these commercial districts, quite frankly, often there's underutilized office buildings and big box buildings. As architects and planners, do you see the opportunity in retrofitting and reusing those buildings rather than bulldozing them and building new?
Well, the housing obviously has a different code requirement for them. So you're taking a dead mall, and the middle of it, the guts of it, doesn't have the light and air and access that a building code would say that a residential needs. And so it might cost more money to fix it and make it that than it's worth. So the building is worthless at some point. Someone decides at some point that the building is now worthless. The parcel, however, is very good because it's located to jobs and transit and all that other stuff. So it's the parcels that have the potential, maybe not the building.